A-15 mandates that the chair inquire as to whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflicts with respect to matters before the commission. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of a conflict, please so state at this time. Anybody? Yeah, we're not acting on anything today, so I don't think so. All right. Next, we'll move to approving the minutes. Would anybody like to move to approve the minutes?
This is Commissioner Bailey. I so move to minutes.
Great. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. On virtual, I can't remember. Do we need to go one by one? Philip, if you're talking, you're very quiet or muted. Still can't hear you. We are really out of practice with this, y'all.
And that's a good thing.
Hold up a sign that says, I can't read it. Each person. Okay. Hey there, Commissioner Duggan. Okay, we are in the process of trying to approve the minutes. So all in favor, I guess we need to go one by one. So say aye on you, Commissioner Duggan. Was that an aye?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Commissioner Lyerly.
Aye.
Okay. Commissioner Davis.
Aye.
Great. Commissioner Bailey.
Aye.
Commissioner Carter.
Aye.
All right. And Commissioner Harris.
I'm a visitor, so just
Okay,
listening
thanks.
in. Thank you.
My bad. Thank you, Pat. Okay, great. The ayes have it. Minutes are passed. Great. Next, we have one concept about gasoline service stations and dispensing facilities. So Katie, I will hand it over to you.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Sorry for the interruption. But
No, thank you.
I was trying to hold up a sound roll call, but then I realized the pencil line wasn't thick enough to be able to see it, and I don't have a Sharpie laying around. So I was trying to give it a roll call signal.
We did it with charades. It all worked out.
Yeah. Well, adding a little bit of entertainment value to the meeting. Just a little. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Katie, are you ready? We can see the slide perfectly, but we can't hear you if you're talking. Do you want to try saying something now to make sure we can hear you at all?
Are you able to hear me now?
There we go.
All right, great. Sorry about that.
But now the slide isn't up.
Yes, I had to unshare it to get my screen back. Okay, are we good to go now? Screen
Good to go.
And you can hear me. Okay, great. Sorry about that. All right, so I'll be presenting a concept for some upcoming revisions to Rule 15A NCAC 02Q 0802. And this is our exclusionary rule for gasoline service stations and dispensing facilities. So for some background, the provisions in 2Q section 800 outline some exclusionary rules, and these rules redefine a facility's potential emissions as actual emissions for certain industry categories. And that allows the facility to remain a minor source for Title V and for HAPs, so long as their actual emissions remain below the applicable thresholds. So that's 100 tons per year of each regulated pollutant, 25 tons per year of all HAPs, and 10 tons per year of each individual HAP. And so specifically, Rule 02Q 802 provides that gasoline service stations and dispensing facilities can remain a minor source if their annual throughput remains below 15 million gallons per year. And that's calculated on a calendar month rolling average basis. So this rule, for some background, it was originally adopted and became effective in 1995 with the 15 million gallon per year throughput threshold. And emissions from these facilities result from the underground storage tanks, and specifically from filling these tanks and then the breathing and emptying of these tanks, and then also from refueling of vehicles at these stations, both the refueling displacement losses and the spillage. And then the rule also requires incremental reporting to the division. And so once the facility throughput exceeds 10 million gallons, they have to report annually. And once it exceeds 13 million gallons, they have to report semi-annually. And then once they exceed 15 million gallons per year, they have to submit a Title V permit application. So just before this rule became effective in April 1994, EPA promulgated some standards for installation of onboard refueling vapor recovery, or ORVR technology, in new light-duty vehicles and light-duty trucks. And these were implemented in a phased approach. So it began with the requirement for this technology in 40% of new model year 1998 cars. And then it gradually increased those ORVR requirements to various portions of the vehicle fleet. And that was determined by the vehicle type and the model year. And so by 2006, nearly all new gasoline-powered highway vehicles were required to be equipped with ORVR. And in 2012, EPA determined that this technology is in widespread use throughout the motor vehicle fleet for purposes of controlling motor vehicle refueling emissions. And then, of course, over time, the non-ORVR vehicles in the fleet will continue to be replaced with the ORVR vehicles as the fleet turns over. So this ORVR technology in the fleet reduces that vehicle refueling displacement component of the total emissions calculations for these gasoline service stations and dispensing facilities. So as the percentage of the vehicle fleet with this technology increases, so does the maximum amount of gasoline that these facilities can dispense while keeping their actual emissions below major source thresholds. So the division's intending to propose an increase to the annual throughput limit in 15A and CO2Q 802 to incorporate the presence of this vapor recovery technology in the vehicle fleet and utilize current AP 42 emission factors in the calculation. And the application of the phased-in EPA requirements to the recent vehicle registration inventory in North Carolina indicates about 85% of the state's light-duty vehicles and light-duty trucks would be equipped with this technology. So based on this, a preliminary analysis indicates a recalculated threshold of about 43 million gallons. So today we're here to present the concept to the Air Quality Committee. And looking at the tentative timeline for this rulemaking, we are expecting to present the draft rules and the fiscal note to the AQC in September, to the EMC in November to request to proceed to public comment and hearing. That would give us a public comment period extending from December through February, adoption by the EMC, request for adoption by the EMC in March, and we're looking at a tentative effective date of May of next year. And so with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? I have one. Was this change asked for by folks in the industry, or what motivated, aside from the expansion of the new technology, what motivated you guys bringing this change now?
Yes, we did receive requests from the regulated community regarding this threshold, and helped us identify this kind of update and the increased presence of the technology. And so I do believe some synthetic minor permits have been issued using the 43 million gallon per year threshold. But our rules still require the 15 million, or specified 15 million. So it was prompted by an industry request. Yes.
Okay. And have any other states made this change that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of any other states making this change. We have begun corresponding with EPA just to let them know that this change is something that we're considering, and received just some very preliminary feedback from them, but we haven't identified other states that have done this yet.
Okay. Are there any other questions from anybody? All right, hearing none, I guess we'll see that in September is the plan.
Yes.
Great. We do not have any action items for today. We do have something on the agenda for tomorrow, the electronic submittal of documents. Director Abrazinskis, or would anybody like to say anything about that before tomorrow's meeting?
Thank you, Chair Monis. I don't have anything to add before tomorrow's meeting. I think it's a pretty straightforward agenda item, but staff will be glad to take questions if there are any here today.
Hearing none, I think we can move on to our information items. So the first one is about startup shutdown and malfunctions. So Joelle Burleson, would you please share your update?
Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you for having me today.
Good
I
morning.
was asked to provide you guys with a brief update on a topic that's been somewhat long-running in nature, and that is, as the chair said, the startup shutdown and malfunction SIP call. So to do that, I thought I would start by providing just a little bit of a recap, very quick recap on some of the key points of and actions that have occurred over time. So I think we're ready to go now. So if we can go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. Back in 2011, the Sierra Club filed a petition asking EPA to find that state implementation plans or SIPs that contain startup, shutdown, and malfunction provisions were inadequate. In May of 2015, some 4 years later, EPA announced that its policy that SIP provisions containing exemptions from emission limits that during startup, shutdown, and malfunction events are inconsistent with the Clean Air Act, and they issued a SIP call for some 36 states or local air programs, including North Carolina. In August of 2015, a number of states challenged that SIP call in the DC circuit. Next slide, please. Those cases were then consolidated in what's been often referred to as the 2015 SSM SIP call challenge. And the key issues that were brought to the forefront as part of that are whether a finding of substantial inadequacy requires considering impacts on the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and attainment of those standards, whether SSM provisions are inconsistent with the Clean Air Act, notwithstanding any general duty provisions or other requirements that apply at all times, and whether director's discretion provisions authorize states, excuse me, dry throat here, to unlawfully modify SIPs without following Clean Air Act procedures. Briefings on these issues and this court challenge were completed back in October of 2016. After that, the case was held in abeyance from April of 2017 through at least January of this year, and remains in January of last year. The oral arguments were held back in March of 2022, and we're still awaiting a decision on this particular case. Next slide, please. In 2016, you may recall, those of you that were on the commission at the time, that the EMC amended and adopted rules 15A NCAC O2D 535 was amended, and we adopted a new rule called O2D 0545. Those rules were a pair of rules that were adopted with contingent applicability language so that one rule would apply depending on the outcome of the court case or other actions that would resolve the issue that might have occurred, or the other rule would apply depending on how the outcome turned out. Those rules were later amended to have a future effective date that would be when North Carolina's SIP contained those rules. So that would be after the court activity had been resolved. Next slide, please. In 2020, there were several actions that occurred relative to the SSM SIP call. In January, EPA Region 6 obtained approval to deviate from national policy and withdrew its SIP call for one of 3 states, and that was Texas. In April, Region 4 obtained approval to deviate from that same national policy and withdrew North Carolina's SIP call. Later then, in July of that same year, the EMC, as part of the rules readoption process, adopted 2D 535 as it currently exists, and that became effective November 1st, 2020. And that package was submitted to EPA for approval into the SIP. In October of 2020, EPA withdrew its 2015 policy and proposed to address startup shutdown and malfunction provisions on a case-by-case basis in light of the SIP as a whole. Later in October, they also, in Region 7, withdrew the Iowa SIP call. Next slide, please. Environmental groups filed suit to challenge EPA's withdrawal of these SIP calls for North Carolina, Texas, and Iowa between 2020 and 2021. In April, DAQ submitted its readopted O2D 535 that became effective in November of 2020 as part of the Group 6 readoption package for EPA approval. In September of 2021, EPA did reinstate its 2015 policy. And in all of the cases listed, the court granted EPA's motion for voluntary remand to EPA without vacature so that EPA could reconsider the SIP calls in light of its reinstatement of the 2015 startup shutdown and malfunction policy. Next slide, please. The Sierra Club filed suit against EPA, and the concerns were that the point of their suit was to compel EPA to make findings of failures to submit the SIPs in response to the 2015 SIP call and take action to approve or disapprove SIPs that were submitted in response to that call. In January of 2022, EPA published findings of failure to submit for 12 states and districts. Because North Carolina's SIP call had already been withdrawn, they were not part of that particular finding of failure publication. On June of 27th of 2022, the court entered a consent decree that established various deadlines for EPA to take action on pending SIP submittals. And again, North Carolina did not have a specific deadline assigned. As part of that, however, EPA did indicate that they would be taking another look at North Carolina, Iowa, and Texas as withdrawn states submittals and reconsidering their actions. Next slide, please. In 2022, back in August, North Carolina, because the SIP call had been withdrawn for North Carolina, we withdrew our 2016 SSM SIP submittal. In 2023, the beginning of this year, we coordinated with the Office of Administrative Hearings to do some administrative housekeeping on closeout on 2D 535, the version from 2016 that had become obsolete, that previously had a delayed effective date in its history note. And so they updated the current history note to reflect some of that history so it's not lost over time. We also withdrew our request for approval of rules in the Group 6 submittal with the startup shutdown malfunction provisions that EPA didn't consider approvable, including O2D 535 and a rule O2D 1423, which dealt with large internal combustion engines. And that rule, although not part of the original SIP call, was part of the action under which the SIP call was withdrawn and contained a paragraph G that EPA considered to have an automatic exemption provision. Next slide, please. In February of this year, EPA proposed to reinstate its 2015 SIP call for North Carolina, finding substantial inadequacy with respect to the SSM provisions in the SIP, specifically with 15A NCAC O2D 535C and G, which were part of the original SIP call, and again 1423G. Revised rules, if needed in response to this proposed SIP call, if finalized, would be due as proposed 18 months after EPA takes final action to finalize its rule. They expect to do that by the end of this year. In April of this year, we submitted comments on this proposal and respectfully disagreed with EPA's determination that the SIP is substantially inadequate and that the North Carolina SSM provisions are inconsistent with the Clean Air Act. Next slide, please. So our comments were essentially that EPA really didn't consider the SIP as a whole, and as a result did not account for the ways in which other provisions in the SIP work to ensure attainment and maintenance with the NAAQS, even during startup, shutdown, and malfunction events. Also, EPA improperly failed to account for the wealth of available evidence demonstrating that our current implementation of the SSM provisions hasn't impeded our state from achieving our national ambient air quality standards in all areas of the state. We also noted that EPA has erroneously determined that implementation of our director's discretion provision involves the unlawful modification of North Carolina SIP. When we consider those provisions, they simply establish a framework for when and how the director determines whether an SSM event constitutes a violation of the applicable rule. Also, EPA, we felt, was incorrect that the subject SIP provisions are inconsistent with the text of the Clean Air Act, which gives the discretion to the states, fairly broad discretion, to determine whatever mix of requirements are necessary or appropriate to attain and maintain the NAAQS. Next slide, please. So our comments also supported something that we see as a potential path forward. In recent actions EPA has taken to approve the SSM rules submitted by other states, specifically New Mexico, Missouri, and Oklahoma, they made it clear that removing SSM provisions from the SIP while retaining them in the state law for state purposes only is an acceptable means of satisfying the SIP call. We supported providing states the maximum time allowed under the Clean Air Act to respond to the final SIP call once it's finalized, if there should be any rulemaking needed. Next slide, please. So just a few things to keep in mind when we're talking about the SSM SIP call. In North Carolina, our experience has been that these are infrequent events. Our rules only apply to a subset of sources. They do not apply to sources subject to the new source performance standards, MACT or NESHAPs. And over time, EPA has been going in and updating their NSPS, MACT, and NESHAPs to deal with SSM provisions that they did not find appropriate or adequate. Here in North Carolina, we currently adopt those by reference in an automatic adoption format. North Carolina's startup, shutdown, and malfunction rules establish concrete factors that the division must consider when the director determines if excess emissions are the result of a malfunction or startup or shutdown conditions. Next slide, please. So what do we see as the next steps potentially? Based on how EPA has proceeded to approve some of those other states we discussed, SIP submittals, North Carolina could submit a request for approval of its current version of OTD 535 that we readopted back in November of 2020, accepting paragraphs 0535C and G and 1423G. we could then, you may have a question then, well, what would the impact of that really be? So as we see it, the impact of excluding CNG would be that violations caused by startup shutdown malfunction events could be subject to federal enforcement and third-party citizen suits. So we would propose to continue to follow the court and EPA activity, hoping that there will be resolution at some point to the court, and we'll see a decision sometime soon. We would consider potential options should the startup shutdown malfunction SIP call be reinstated for North Carolina when it finalizes its proposed rule. And we would provide periodic updates to the Air Quality Committee as related activity evolves. Next slide. I think that's it. But if you were to have any questions, you feel free to contact me, Katie Quinlan, our Rules Development Branch Supervisor, or Director Abrazinskas. And otherwise, I would just like to thank Director Abrazinskas, Asher Spiller, and Randy Strait, Katie Quinlan, and Taylor Hartsfield for their, as well as Steve Hall and our compliance section, our technical services section chief, for information they provided and or reviewed in preparation of the presentation.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions?
This is Commissioner Bailey, and I have some questions. Excuse me.
Great, go ahead. And
Sorry.
can we stop sharing the slides so we can see folks?
The question I had, two questions was, you're saying that this rule isn't covered for NSPS, MACT, or NESHAP sources. What companies are covered by this? And then I was also interested in what guidance the director uses to decide whether or not it's a violation. Does it meet the SSM rule? So that's the two-part question. What sources are we talking about?
Okay, so it would be any of the sources that are not subject to new performers, NESHAPs, or MAC standards. So sources at a facility, it could be any type of industry or company that has a specific source that isn't explicitly covered by a MAC or NESHAP throughout the state. So it covers a broad range of industries.
Oh, I guess I was looking for more examples because so many industries are Title V and they are subject to NSPS, MACs, and NESHAP. So I was like, what's left? Is it smaller sources? Is it not Title V? I mean, can you give, it's not Duke Energy, right?
It could be any of those sources like Duke Energy also have specific provisions that are covered, but that cover them and their specific utilities and larger sources. Excuse me, but it could be sources within the facility that have specific requirements under the state rules, but do not necessarily get covered under MACT or NESHAP sources. So really it could be any industry. It's just sources not covered by those specific provisions of rules. Does that make
say
a
like
little sense?
Title V permit has like several sources. I mean, a Title V permit can have, I don't know, 20 different sources on a manufacturing site. And you're just saying some of them might be MACT or NESHAPs or NSPS, but then there's some that aren't. And so even in one Title V permit, this rule could apply to a certain number of sources within one manufacturing site.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then the next question is, so it is a really, broadly based rule that affects a lot of industries.
That is correct.
Okay, and so then this part is what is, just curious, I didn't look at the rule, but what is the criteria the director uses to decide whether or not a violation is excused under the, SSM kind of gives you a break from being tagged with a violation?
Yes, ma'am. And let me just make sure I don't miss any of those criteria, but let me pull this back up here. So to qualify as a malfunction, for instance, the XX emissions would have to last for more than 4 hours and result from, say, a malfunction, a breakdown of process or control equipment or any other abnormal conditions. And let's see, that's one key element right from the get-go that has to be considered as to whether it is actually a malfunction or not, or a startup shutdown violation might occur. To determine if the excess emissions is a result of a malfunction, the director considers 7 items along with any other pertinent information, but basically whether the air cleaning device, process equipment, or process has been maintained and operated to the maximum extent practicable, consistent with good practice for minimizing emissions, whether repairs have been made expeditiously, when the emission limits have been exceeded, whether the amount and duration of the excess emissions, including any bypass, have been minimized to the maximum extent practicable, whether all practical steps have been taken to minimize the impact of excess emissions or ambient air quality, whether the excess emissions are not part of a recurring pattern that would indicate a design, operation, or maintenance issue, and whether all the requirements of the paragraph have been met, and if a source has been required to have a malfunction abatement plan, that they followed that plan.
So how is that different from the ones that are associated with, I mean, that sounds pretty detailed in terms of trying to figure it's, if it truly is a malfunction. So how is this, what's the big complaint from the citizens groups or EPA about, what is it that's so insufficient about that, I guess I'm asking.
Well, I think I don't know that we would agree that it's necessarily insufficient, but I think that EPA has a preference for that to be explicit for specific source types and categories, and to not have discretion given to all the directors in general, or into all of the agencies in general. And I don't know if Director Abrazenskis has anything he'd like to share relative to his perspective on that.
Thank you, Joelle. Yeah, I mean, I think your observation is a great one, Commissioner Bailey, that we view those factors that Joelle just read off from the rule to be very clear on what we can consider in these cases, and the facts related to these are infrequent. They apply to a subset of the sources at any particular facility, and we're not rubber stamping them. That's a pretty good high bar that must be met here by consideration of those 7 factors in the rule, and the way the rule's been constructed, and it served the state well for decades. And so I think moving forward, I mean, we're excited that there appears to be a path forward and with EPA. In fact, we're hopeful that maybe we can even resolve this before the final SIP call is even issued by EPA to bring us back in. We hope to resolve it prior to then, if possible, to avoid being included in the final SIP call. So all that to say, I think we've approved 3 of these type of cases over the last 3 years, and where there aren't a line of folks wrapped around the building requesting these types of conditions be considered for any particular situation at their facility. So again, it's very, very infrequent, and we think the rule as it stands is serving us well.
Thank you. That's good answer. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I have one question, Maggie. So it clearly doesn't apply to facilities or sources that are under a niche app, so it doesn't apply to hazardous air pollutants regulated in that way. But are there other circumstances where these startup, shutdown, malfunction events could have localized impacts that don't affect overall state compliance? I mean, as I understand it, it sounds like the argument is these are very rare, limited events. They don't affect our ability to comply overall with the Clean Air Act, but they are events that involve emissions beyond those permitted at the facility. And so I'm just curious if part of the concern about these rules and the state's approach to startup, shutdown, malfunction events has been that there may be localized impacts. Is that something to be concerned about?
Joel, I can give that one a shot if you'd
If
like.
you'd like to.
So,
Thanks.
certainly, please add in. You know, I think Commissioner Smith, there's a good bit of expert judgment that's needed in a lot of these cases, and so long as we're applying that and using all of our resources and data, and we're requesting all of the pertinent information to look at each particular case, because each one of them is unique to the site-specific facts. You know, I think if our judgment led to us believing that there were some localized adverse impacts, you know, that's an important thing for us to be considering, I guess, and we would consider that as to whether to treat it under this rule or treat it as a violation.
Thanks. I guess one follow-up question about what the status of the litigation is. That's a little confusing. So it sounds like there are two pending cases, or have been two cases. One was the original case that you said was held in abeyance for several years, finally argued last spring, and apparently is still awaiting a decision. And so that was the original Sierra Club challenge to the way EPA was responding to state SSM provisions. So that's still pending. And then there was the later Sierra Club legal action to try to compel EPA to take steps to bring states into compliance with the 2015 SIP call. It's a little odd that that was allowed to be a separate case. And maybe it doesn't matter for purposes of what we need to do, but it is confusing that there is both the broader case and then an entirely separate case that has to do with enforcing the 2015 SIP. I would normally have thought that would arise in the context of some sort of motion for either a stay or a preliminary injunction or something in the original case. But without getting down into the weeds of that, can you explain where this could go? So the EPA is currently taking steps under the second case to deal with states, but in the background, we've got the older case, the broader case. Is there potential here for the EMC to have to act and then potentially reverse action based on how these two different legal proceedings go forward?
Thank you, Commissioner Smith. I think that the key case is the one in the DC Circuit, and really what I think is at stake there is, will the 2015 SSM federal policy be upheld or not? I think that's the crux of it. And if it is, then this action to bring us back into the SIP call is most certainly relevant, and we will need to take some sort of action. If that case goes the other direction, then we're going to have to pause and reassess, and it's possible we may need to take no actions. But in either case, I'm not sure that, and Joelle, please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure if official rulemaking actions will be necessary given the pathways that EPA has laid before us, given our existing rule is what it is, 535 on the books today. And the potential path forward, if the 2015 policy is upheld by the DC Circuit, our path forward would be to simply resubmit that existing rule text to EPA for review and approval into the SIP, except for 2 paragraphs that they believe are inconsistent with the policy.
That's my understanding. Yes.
And so to do that, I don't think the AQC or the EMC would have to take any actions. Certainly, we would consult with you all either way, as we are today, just to bring you up to speed. But I'm not sure that there's a pathway that will need to result in additional rulemaking.
And finally, Chair Monis, one last follow-up question to that, and I guess that may be something we just need to spend a little time looking at the language of that rule in terms of whether the rule is written in a way that allows for that kind of partial enforcement. And I confess I have not looked back at the rule, so that's something I need to do. But it's a little unusual to have a situation where we would say to EPA, we're resubmitting this rule, but pay no attention to 2 paragraphs, which nevertheless will remain in the rule, and presumably by remaining in the rule will continue to be enforceable. But thanks. I think, like I said, that may require a little more thought as things move along about how that rule is currently written and whether that works or not.
Well, we will certainly keep everyone posted as these things evolve, and I believe the recent approaches that EPA has taken in those other states, and even I believe some local programs as well, as that path forward is already on the books in a few cases, so that's good. And I think that one key piece in Joelle's last slide was the impact of not including paragraphs within a rule into the SIP is that any violations that result from an SSM event would be subject to federal enforcement or third-party suits. That's the practical effect, as I understand them, of that approach.
Thanks. That's all for me.
Thank you. Then I'm going to hand it back to Director Abrazinskas for any remarks.
All right, thank you, Chair Monist, and good morning again. 2 quick items or announcements this morning. First, this week we are expecting US EPA to release their new source performance standards for GHG emissions for new, modified, and reconstructed fossil fuel-fired electric generating units, or EGUs. And we're expecting them to release emission guidelines for GHG emissions from existing fossil fuel-fired EGUs. And we're expecting EPA to simultaneously repeal the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, or ACE rule. These are the Section 111B standards and 111D guidelines for GHG emissions from the electric generating sector. And you'll recall that the first rendition of these, this package of rules and guidelines was called the Clean Power Plan, or CPP, many years ago. Then the second rendition was called the Affordable Clean Energy, or ACE rule, And so this proposal would now be the third version of this rule package or guideline package on this matter. And so with the proposal expected this week, I'm expecting that we're going to be starting an intense period of review in order to evaluate it and comment if appropriate. So stay tuned for that. Again, we'll be looking for that announcement from EPA later this week. And the second item this morning is a quick announcement that some of you may have seen in the news last week. And I want to say thanks to Commissioner Carter, because I believe he was the first one to even make me aware of the story as it came out of the U.S. Attorney's Office. But the owner or operator of an auto repair shop down in Charlotte that fraudulently coded over 15,000 vehicles that would have otherwise failed their vehicle emissions inspection, that person was sentenced to 12 months and 1 day in prison and ordered to pay over $1.2 million in fines and $82,000 in restitution to the state. The results of this case were announced, like I said, last week by the U.S. District Attorney's Office, and the court records alleged that this shop owner executed a scheme of doing county swaps by falsifying in the system that the county of the registration of many of the failing vehicles. He basically changed them from one county where emissions testing is required to where it's not required. He also changed the characterization of some of the light duty trucks, which are subject to the program, to heavy duty trucks, which are not subject to the program. And he also allegedly charged drivers between $80 and $150 to pass them with this scheme. So the article referenced that he reportedly paid the state only 85 cents per safety inspection instead of the required $6.35 per vehicle charge he would have paid for that inspection. So just a few of the facts I want to share with you on that case. This was something, it was a joint effort between US EPA's Office of Inspector General, their Criminal Investigation Division, and the North Carolina Department of Transportation License and Theft Bureau, and Division of Motor Vehicles working with the U.S. Attorney's Office on the case. And again, I think you can probably Google this and find some of the greater details and a write-up and a press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office online. So I think that's all I'll share today. I'll save the remainder of my remarks for tomorrow's meeting for the full commission. And thank you very much. Glad to take questions.
Well, glad they caught that guy. Any questions for Director Abrazinskis? If not, I don't have people indicated for these last two things, which are just the calendar and the status of rulemaking hearings and rule development. So did anybody want to go over those, or are those just there for reference for members of the committee? All right, well, if folks want to know what we've been doing all the way back to 1995, please do click on that link. With that, I don't have any other closing remarks to make. I have emailed a few of you. We're thinking about when our next meeting will be scheduled, so please do check your email. But aside from that, if there are no further questions, I think we can wrap.
This is Commissioner Carter. I do have a question. So
Yeah.
I guess based on your last comment, then the special meeting in June you've not picked a date yet for that?
Not yet. We're still considering the possibility. Thank you for sending your availability. Those of you who have not done so, please do.
And I guess related to that is the question I had included in my response back to you was about the status of the fiscal note.
Director Abrazinskis, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, we're just not quite ready with it, and and that's really why we're talking about a June meeting at this point, is to bring all the materials, text, fiscal note, environmental justice slides, the whole package at a date to be determined in June.
Well, I guess I just urge that we're going to need that to see those materials before that, well before that meeting, if we're going to have a special meeting in June. If it's going to be deferred to July, obviously that's the timing is different. But if we're going to have a meeting in about a month from now or less, depending on when that date is, we need to see those materials very shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. We understand that.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Are there any other questions?
I'd just like to say the next meeting for groundwater is to start at 10:45, and if anybody will be attending that, I don't think I can start it any sooner. Is that right? I have to wait till 10:45? Attorney Reynolds?
Sorry, you were asking about starting, the committees can start up to 15 minutes after the end of the committee before it.
Oh, so I can start it earlier. I can start it at 10:15?
In my view, yes, as long as you have a quorum, Madam Chair.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
All right, then I'll declare this committee meeting adjourned, and we'll see y'all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.